My name is Audrey Fletcher. I'm 58 years old, and I thought I knew my son better than anyone in the world. Marcus was my only child, the light of my life after his father died when he was just 12. For 23 years, it had been just the two of us against the world. I had sacrificed everything to give him the best life possible, working double shifts as a nurse, selling my mother's antique jewelry to pay for his college, even taking out a second mortgage on our house in Portland so he could pursue his MBA without debt. I thought we were a team. I thought he respected me. I thought wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started 3 weeks ago when I couldn't log into my Netflix account. The password I'd been using for years suddenly didn't work. Then my Amazon account locked me out. My email, my banking app, one by one, every digital door in my life slammed shut, and when I called Marcus for help, he had an excuse for everything. "Mom, you probably just forgot," he'd say with that patient tone people use with elderly relatives. "Let me handle it for you." But I hadn't forgotten anything. Someone had systematically changed every password I owned, and that someone lived in my guest bedroom and called me Mom. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody knew, was that his dead father had left me something more valuable than life insurance. Hidden in accounts scattered across 3 countries were investments and savings that had grown quietly for over 2 decades. Accounts that required more than a simple password reset. Accounts that required biometric verification, physical tokens, and security measures that no amount of tech-savvy manipulation could bypass. My son thought he was protecting me from myself, thought he was taking control of a confused older woman's finances. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to control had been quietly building a financial fortress he couldn't even see, let alone breathe. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very technology meant to make our lives easier had become the weapon my own child used against me. But sometimes the deepest betrayals come wrapped in concern, and sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who understand us least. This is the story of how I discovered that love without respect is just another form of control, and how a mother's quiet strength can move mountains that her son never even knew existed. Marcus had always been what teachers called a good kid. Straight A's, never in trouble, polite to adults and responsible beyond his years. After David died in that construction accident, Marcus stepped up in ways that broke my heart and made me proud in equal measure. He'd wake up early to help me with breakfast, walk our neighbor's dog for extra money, and sit with me during those first terrible months when grief felt like drowning in slow motion. Everyone said we were lucky to have each other, that we made such a strong team. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I let him grow up thinking he was my partner instead of my child. Maybe I leaned on him too heavily, shared too much, trusted too completely. When you're a single mother working 60-hour weeks just to keep the lights on, you don't have the luxury of maintaining perfect boundaries. You take help wherever you can find it, even if it comes from a 13-year-old boy who's already carrying more weight than he should. Marcus was brilliant with computers from an early age. While other kids his age were playing video games, he was building. He set up our home network, managed our streaming subscriptions, and gradually became the tech support for our entire household. When I struggled with online banking or couldn't figure out why my phone wasn't syncing properly, Marcus was always there with patient explanations and quick fixes. I was grateful. God, I was so grateful for his help. "Mom, you really should use stronger passwords," he'd tell me, watching over my shoulder as I typed in, "David Forever 23 for the 100th time. Someone could hack into your account." I'd laugh and ruffle his hair, calling him my little computer genius. I updated my passwords to the ones he suggested, used the password manager he installed, let him handle the digital side of our lives, because he was so much better at it than I was. Looking back, I can see how it started. The small comments about my computer illiteracy, the way he'd sigh when I asked for help with something he considered basic, the gradual shift from teaching me to simply doing things for me. It was so gradual, so wrapped in helpfulness, that I didn't notice when assistance became management and management became control. Our house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood had been David's dream. A 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, a kitchen that opened onto a garden where he planned to grow vegetables, and a front porch where we'd sit on summer evenings, watching neighbors walk their dogs. After the accident, I considered selling it a dozen times. The mortgage was crushing, the maintenance overwhelming, and every corner held memories that sometimes felt too heavy to carry. But Marcus loved that house. His room was on the second floor, overlooking the garden his father never got to plant. He'd spend hours up there, surrounded by computer monitors and textbooks, working on projects I didn't understand, but was proud of anyway. "This is our home, Mom," he'd say whenever I mentioned selling. Dad would want us to keep it, and he was right. David would have wanted that. So I worked extra shifts at the hospital, picked up weekend work at a clinic across town, and slowly, painfully, we made it work. Marcus got a partial scholarship to Portland State, then a full ride to complete his MBA at Oregon Health and Science University. I was so proud watching him walk across that stage, diploma in hand, ready to take on the world. My baby boy had grown into a successful, educated man, and I had done that. We had done that together. The problems started when Marcus moved back home, after graduation. "Just temporarily, Mom," he assured me, "until I find the right position." I was thrilled to have him back. The house had felt so empty with just me rattling around in it, and after years of sacrifice and worry, I was looking forward to some time with my successful son. Maybe we could travel together, or renovate the kitchen, or finally plant that garden David had dreamed of. But the Marcus who moved back home wasn't quite the same person who had left for graduate school. He was more serious, more intense, and he looked at me differently. Not with the warm affection I remembered, but with something that felt almost like assessment. He'd watch me fumble with my phone and shake his head slightly. He'd offer to help with bills and banking with a tone that suggested I couldn't handle these things myself. "Mom, you're not getting any younger," he said one evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork, trying to reconcile my checking account. "Maybe it's time to think about simplifying things. Let me handle some of this for you." I looked up at him, confused by the suggestion. I was 58, not 88. I had been managing my own finances for decades, but the way he said it, with such gentle authority, made me question myself. Was I struggling more than I realized? Marcus had a way of presenting his concerns that made them sound so reasonable. "I've been reading about elder fraud," he'd say over breakfast. "Seniors lose billions every year to scammers. I just want to protect you." Or, "Mom, you left your laptop open again. Anyone could access your account." These conversations always ended the same way, with Marcus offering to take over some aspect of my digital life, just to be safe. The first password he changed was my email. "Your account got flagged for suspicious activity," he explained, showing me an official-looking warning message on his phone. I had to reset everything. "Here's your new password." He handed me a slip of paper with a complex string of letters and numbers that looked nothing like the simple passwords I preferred. "Don't write this down anywhere else, Mom. That's how people get hacked." I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't? This was my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had sacrificed everything for. If Marcus said my accounts were vulnerable, then they must be. If he said I needed stronger security, then I needed stronger security. I updated my password manager with the new information, and thought nothing more of it. The second change came a week later. My banking app suddenly required two-factor authentication, and Marcus explained that he'd upgraded my security after noticing some irregular login attempts. "Someone in Romania tried to access your account," he said, showing me a screenshot that meant nothing to me but looked alarming. "I've set it up so that all authentication codes come to my phone too, just as backup. That way if your phone dies or gets stolen, you won't be locked out." It made sense. It all made perfect sense. Marcus was looking out for me, protecting me from threats I didn't even understand. I felt grateful and slightly embarrassed by my own technological ignorance. Here was my brilliant son, using his expertise to keep his aging mother safe from cybercriminals and scammers. What loving child wouldn't do the same? But then came the streaming services. "I consolidated everything under a family plan," Marcus explained when I couldn't log into Netflix one evening. It's more efficient this way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And you don't have to remember multiple passwords. Then my Amazon account. I noticed some weird charges that looked like fraud attempts. I've secured everything and set up better monitoring. Then my social media accounts. Mom, you were about to fall for a classic phishing scam. I saw the email you almost replied to. Each explanation was reasonable. Each change was presented as protection. Each time I thanked him for looking out for me, but slowly, quietly I was being locked out of my own digital life. When I wanted to buy something online, I had to ask Marcus for the password. When I wanted to check my bank balance, I had to go through When I wanted to watch a movie, Marcus had to log me in. It's temporary, he always said, just until you get more comfortable with cybersecurity. But weeks passed, then months, and I never got access back. Instead, Marcus became the gatekeeper to my own life, and I began to feel like a guest in my own existence. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was getting ready for my shift at the hospital, running late because I'd spent 20 minutes trying to access my work email on my phone. The password wasn't working, again, and when I called Marcus for help, he didn't answer. I made it to work flustered and frustrated, spending my lunch break trying to reach him. "Sorry, Mom," he said, when he finally called back. "I was in a meeting." "What's the problem?" I explained about the email, about feeling locked out of everything, about how exhausting it was to need his permission for every digital task. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "We need to have a serious conversation," Marcus said finally. "I've been meaning to talk to you about this. Can we sit down tonight when you get home?" His tone was different, more formal, almost businesslike. It made my stomach clench with a feeling I couldn't name. That evening, Marcus was waiting for me in the living room, with his laptop open, and a folder of papers spread across the coffee table. He gestured for me to sit across from him, and suddenly I felt like I was in a job interview rather than talking to my son in my own home. "Mom," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I've been monitoring your accounts for the past few months, and I'm concerned, really concerned." He turned his laptop toward me, showing spreadsheets and charts that looked official but meant nothing to me. "Your spending patterns are erratic. You're making impulsive purchases, falling for marketing scams, and frankly, some of your recent decisions suggest cognitive decline." The words hit me like a physical blow. Cognitive decline. He was suggesting that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't be trusted with my own money, my own life. I stared at the charts, trying to understand what I was looking at, but they might as well have been written in a foreign language. "These charges here," Marcus pointed to highlighted entries on the screen, $60 at a bookstore, $85 at a garden center, $42 for takeout. "Mom, you're bleeding money on unnecessary expenses." I looked at the transactions he was highlighting. Books for my reading group, plants for the garden David had wanted, dinner from the Thai place down the street when I was too tired to cook after a 12-hour shift. These weren't erratic spending patterns, this was my life. "And this," he continued, pulling out printed bank statements covered in yellow highlighter. "You've been withdrawing cash regularly, large amounts. What are you doing with all this cash, Mom?" I tried to remember. Some of it went to Maria, our housekeeper who preferred cash payment. Some went to tips, to charity, to small expenses that were easier to handle with bills rather than cards. Normal things that normal people did with their own money. But sitting there, looking at Marcus's presentation, I began to doubt myself. Was I spending too much? Were my decisions really that questionable? My son was educated in business and finance. He understood these things better than I did. Maybe he was right to be concerned. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "it would be best if I took over managing your finances completely, just for a while, until we can get a better handle on your spending." He pulled out a power of attorney document, already filled out, waiting only for my signature. "This would give me legal authority to manage your accounts, pay your bills, make sure you're not being taken advantage." I stared at the document, my hands shaking slightly. "Marcus, I'm not incompetent. I've been managing my own money for 40 years. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Had I been managing it well? The evidence he'd presented suggested otherwise. I know this is hard, Marcus said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. But Mom, I love you too much to watch you make financial mistakes that could jeopardize your future. Trust me on this. Let me take care of you the way you took care of me all those years. The appeal to our shared history was what broke me. All those years of sacrifice, of working extra shifts, of going without so Marcus could have everything he needed. He was right. I had taken care of him, and now he wanted to return the favor. Maybe this was what good children did for aging parents. Maybe this was love. I signed the document. Within a week, Marcus had consolidated all of my accounts under his management. Every credit card, every bank account, every investment I thought I had access to, was now filtered through my son. He set up a weekly allowance for me, deposited into a checking account with my name on it. But his oversight, "This will cover all your basic needs," he explained, plus a little extra for entertainment and personal expenses. The allowance was reasonable, I suppose, enough for groceries, gas, small purchases, but it felt like being given lunch money by my parent, except I was the parent, and he was the child. The power dynamic in our relationship had flipped completely, and I wasn't sure how it had happened so quickly. What about larger expenses? I asked. What if I need new tires, or want to book a vacation, or have a medical emergency? Marcus smiled patiently. That's what I'm here for, Mom. You just tell me what you need, and I'll take care of it. No more worrying about bills or managing accounts or keeping track of passwords. I've got it all handled. But I was worrying. For the first time in months, I was lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and wondering what had happened to my life. During the day, I felt like an actor playing the role of myself. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, watched television, but nothing felt real anymore. I was living in my own house, but following someone else's rules, spending my own money but only with someone else's permission. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early October. I had been looking forward to this day for weeks. My reading group was taking a trip to Powell's Books, followed by lunch at a nice restaurant downtown. It was the kind of small pleasure that had become rare in my carefully managed life, and I was excited to spend a day with friends doing something I loved. But when I tried to buy books at Powell's, my card was declined. I tried again thinking it was a machine error, but the result was the same. Humiliated, I had to ask my friend Rebecca to cover my purchases while I stepped outside to call Marcus. Mom, you've already spent your weekly allowance, he explained when I reached him. Remember, you bought groceries on Monday, got gas on Wednesday, and there was that charge at the pharmacy. You only have about $30 left until next week. I did quick math in my head. Groceries, gas, and prescription co-pays had somehow exhausted an allowance that was supposed to last 7 days. But it's Saturday, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I have 4 more days until the week resets, and this is just books, Marcus. I'm at Powell's with my reading group. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him calculating whether this qualified as an emergency worthy of additional funds. How much do you need? He asked finally. I looked at the stack of books Rebecca was holding for me, 3 paperbacks, and a cookbook. Maybe $40 total. $50 would cover it, I said. Another pause. Okay, I'll transfer $50 to your account, but Mom, we really need to work on your budget. This kind of overspending is exactly what we're trying to avoid. I hung up the phone feeling like a teenager who had just been scolded for exceeding her allowance. My friends pretended not to notice my embarrassment, but I saw the looks they exchanged. Rebecca handed me my books with a gentle smile that somehow made everything worse. These were women my own age, all of whom managed their own finances, made their own decisions, lived their own lives. And here I was, a grown woman with a graduate degree and decades of work experience, unable to buy a book without permission from my son. That night, I sat in my garden for hours, surrounded by the plants I had bought with my own money that was no longer really mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that the flowers David had dreamed of were finally blooming, but I couldn't enjoy them because I felt like a prisoner in the paradise I had worked so hard to create. I began to realize that what Marcus called protection felt an awful lot like control. What he called concern looked suspiciously like manipulation. And what he called love was starting to feel like a cage made of good intentions and financial dependency. I was 58 years old, mentally sharp, physically healthy, and fully capable of managing my own life. So why was I living like someone's dependent child? The answer, I was beginning to understand, lay somewhere in the gap between the son I thought I knew and the man who was systematically dismantling my autonomy one password at a time. But what Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his father had left us both a legacy that existed far beyond the reach of power of attorney documents and password manager, a legacy that I had been quietly nurturing for over 20 years, and that was about to remind my son that his mother was far more resourceful than he had ever imagined. The next morning I made a decision that would change everything. But first, I needed to remember exactly what David had left us, and more importantly, what I had done with his final gift in the years since his death. It was time to visit some accounts that didn't appear on any of Marcus's carefully organized spreadsheets, accounts that required more than a simple password reset to access. It was time to show my son that there are some doors that can't be locked by someone else's idea of what's best for you. The memories came back in pieces as I sat in my car outside the downtown branch of Wells Fargo, holding a small metal object I hadn't touched in almost a year. It was a security token, about the size of a thumb drive, that generated new access codes every 60 seconds. David had given it to me 3 weeks before he died, along with instructions that seemed overly paranoid at the time but now felt like prophecy. "Audrey," he had said, his voice serious in a way that made me stop folding laundry and really listen. "If something happens to me, if I'm not here to take care of you and Marcus, there are things you need to know. Things I've set up." He handed me the token along with a manila envelope sealed with his neat engineer's tape. "Don't open this, unless you have to, but if you do have to, everything you need is inside." I had protested, told him nothing was going to happen, that he was being dramatic. David was 45 years old, healthy and strong, with no reason to think about mortality, but he insisted, making me promise to put the envelope somewhere safe and never mention it to anyone, not even Marcus. "This is insurance," he said, "the kind you hope you never need, but can't afford to be without." 3 weeks later, David was dead, killed instantly when a crane collapsed at his construction site. In the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements, and single parenthood, I had forgotten about the envelope. It wasn't until months later, when I was cleaning out his dresser, that I found it tucked behind his old passport and social security card. I almost threw it away, thinking it was just another piece of paperwork to add to the endless pile of documents that needed sorting. But something made me open it. Maybe it was the careful way he had sealed it, or the memory of how serious his voice had been that night. Inside was a handwritten letter in David's precise handwriting, along with account numbers, passwords, and instructions that seemed to describe a financial life I knew nothing about. "My dearest Audrey," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're facing the future without me. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for leaving you alone with so much to figure out, but I'm not sorry for what I've done to try to protect you." The letter went on to explain that David had been quietly moving money offshore for years, small amounts that he skimmed from his construction bonuses and freelance work. Nothing illegal, nothing that avoided taxes, just careful investing in international markets that offered better returns than domestic banks. "I know this seems paranoid," he wrote, "but I've seen too many families lose everything when the unexpected happens. Medical bills, job loss, economic downturns. These things can wipe out a lifetime of savings overnight. This money is hidden not from the government, but from life, from circumstances beyond our control. It's our safety net, yours and Marcus's, when everything else failed." The accounts were spread across 3 countries, Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. Each required different levels of security to access, including biometric verification, physical tokens, and security questions that only I would know the answers to. David had been thorough, almost obsessively so, in creating a system that could only be accessed by me, and only in person. In the months after his death, I had followed his instructions carefully. I traveled to each location, verified my identity, and took control of the account. The amounts were larger than I had expected, not fortune-level money, but substantial enough to change our lives completely. Instead of touching it, I had continued investing, adding small amounts when I could, watching it grow slowly and steadily over the year. The Switzerland account held conservative bonds and precious metals. Singapore contained technology stocks and emerging market funds. The Cayman Islands housed real estate investments and currency hedges. Together they represented 23 years of careful planning and patient investing. Money that Marcus had never known existed, that didn't appear on any domestic financial statement, that couldn't be accessed by any power of attorney document he could produce. I had never told Marcus about these accounts for the same reason. David had hidden them in the first place. Sometimes the people we love most need to be protected from their own knowledge. Marcus was brilliant and ambitious, but he was also impulsive and sometimes reckless with money. During college, he had run up credit card debt that I quietly paid off. After graduation, he had invested in a startup that failed spectacularly, losing his entire savings. I loved my son deeply, but I didn't trust his financial judgment. Now, sitting in my car with David's security token in my hand, I realized that my caution had been wise. The son who was worried about my erratic spending had tried to start 3 different businesses in the past 5 years, each one requiring loans that I had cost. The man lecturing me about financial responsibility had declared bankruptcy during his 2nd year of graduate school. The child who thought I needed protection from my own decisions had never successfully managed money for more than 6 months at a time. But Marcus didn't know any of this about himself because I had always been there to catch him when he fell. I had been the safety net, the backup plan, the quiet financial support that made his risks feel reasonable. And now he was trying to control my money, because he genuinely believed I was incapable of managing it myself. The irony was almost funny. I walked into the bank and asked to speak with someone about international account access. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, directed me to a private office, where I explained that I needed to make some changes to my offshore investment strategy. She asked for identification, account numbers, and my security token. She asked me to place my thumb on a scanner and answer questions about my late husband's middle name, my mother's maiden name, and the street where I grew up. Within an hour I had updated my contact information, changed my access protocols, and arranged for monthly statements to be delivered to a post office box that Marcus didn't know existed. I also made a withdrawal, not a large one, just enough to prove to myself that I could. The bank issued me a certified check for $50,000, money that belonged to me completely and could not be touched by anyone else. Walking out of that bank, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power, not over anyone else, but over my own life. For the first time since Marcus had started protecting me, I had made a financial decision entirely on my own. I had accessed money that was mine, made choices that affected only me, and proved to myself that I was exactly as competent as I had always believed. But the real test was still coming. Tonight, I would go home to my son, the man who controlled my Netflix password and monitored my grocery spending, and I would not tell him what I had done. I would not ask permission, seek approval, or explain myself. I would simply exist as an independent adult in my own home, funded by my own money, making my own choices. And tomorrow I would begin the delicate process of teaching Marcus that his mother was not the helpless woman he thought she was. But first I needed to understand exactly how deep his control went, and what he really thought he was protecting me from. It was time to do some investigating of my own, to learn what my son had been doing with the access I had given him, and to decide how much of my life I was willing to fight to get back. The certified check sat in my purse like a secret weapon, proof that there were parts of my life that existed beyond Marcus's reach. But weapons are only useful if you know how to use them, and I was still learning exactly what kind of battle I was facing. What I did know was that for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not Marcus's confused mother, not a woman in cognitive decline, not someone who needed protection from her own decisions. I was Audrey Fletcher, and I had work to do. The investigation started the way most discoveries do, with a single thread that unraveled everything else when I pulled on it. I came home from the bank that afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in months, the certified check folded carefully in my wallet like a talisman against helplessness. Marcus was in his room, door closed, the sound of a video conference drifting through the walls. I could hear his professional voice, the one he used for business calls, confident and authoritative in a way that reminded me of his father. I made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table, looking around the house that felt different now that I knew I had options. The financial power Marcus held over me was real, but it wasn't absolute. There were resources he didn't know about, accounts he couldn't access, money that remained purely mine, but knowing I had an escape route wasn't the same as understanding why I needed one. That evening Marcus emerged from his room with his laptop and that familiar stack of papers that had become the props for our weekly financial review meetings. These sessions had started as helpful check-ins, but had evolved into something that felt more like performance evaluation. Marcus would review my spending, point out areas for improvement, and make gentle suggestions about how I could be more responsible with the allowance he provided. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into the chair across from me with the easy confidence of someone who controlled the conversation before it started. I wanted to tell him about the bank, about the accounts he didn't know existed, about the power I had just reclaimed. Instead, I smiled and said, "Fine, sweetheart. Just the usual errands." He opened his laptop and pulled up the same spreadsheets that had become the soundtrack to our relationship. "I see you made that purchase at Powell's yesterday," he said, scrolling through transactions. $53 for books. That's quite a bit for a single shopping trip. The way he said it, with that gentle disapproval, made my purchase sound reckless rather than normal. "It was my reading group," I explained, though I hated having to justify buying books with my own money. "We were celebrating finishing our summer reading challenge." Marcus nodded, making a note on his papers. "I understand, but we need to think about sustainable spending habits. $50 here, $60 there. It adds up quickly." As he talked, I found myself studying him in a way I hadn't before. My son was 35 years old, educated and articulate, but when had he become so controlling? When had his helpful suggestions turned into mandate? When had my gratitude for his assistance transformed into dependence on his approval? Speaking of sustainable habits, Marcus continued, "I've been thinking we should consolidate your credit cards. You have 3 different accounts, and it's inefficient to manage multiple payment schedules." He slid a document across the table. "If we close 2 of them and keep just the one with the best terms, it'll simplify your finances significantly." I picked up the paper, scanning the details of cards I had held for years. One was my first credit card, opened when I was 25 and starting my nursing career. Another was a rewards card I used for grocery shopping, earning points I redeemed for household items. The third was a travel card with benefits I rarely used, but kept for emergencies. None of them carried balances, none of them were problems. "Why do I need to close them?" I asked. "They're not costing me anything, and they give me flexibility." Marcus leaned forward, his expression patient but firm. "Mom, multiple credit accounts increase your risk profile. If your identity gets stolen, thieves can open additional lines of credit using your existing accounts as reference. Plus, managing 3 different payment schedules is unnecessarily complicated." The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about it nagged at me. I had been successfully managing these accounts for years without confusion or fraud. Why was it suddenly too complicated for me to handle? "What if I want to keep them?" I asked quietly. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course it's your choice," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just trying to protect you from potential problems. But if you're confident you can manage multiple accounts without making mistakes, then we can keep the current system." The phrase "without making mistakes" hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus was presenting my desire to keep my own credit cards as a test of competence, suggesting that only someone with perfect financial management could handle such complexity. It was manipulation wrapped in concern, and for the first time I recognized it clearly. "I'll think about it," I said, folding the paper and setting it aside. Marcus made another note, his pen scratching against the paper with quiet authority. "Fair enough. Just remember that identity theft is a serious concern for people in your demographic. The statistics are alarming." After he went back to his room, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the closed laptop and scattered papers that had become the instruments of my diminishing autonomy. My demographic. When had my son started seeing me as a demographic rather than a person? When had I become a collection of risk factors and statistics rather than his mother? I needed to understand what was really happening, not just the financial control but the underlying assumptions that made Marcus believe this level of management was necessary. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I went into his room uninvited. Marcus was back on a video call, speaking to someone about market projections and investment strategies. I knocked softly and peeked in, gesturing that I needed to grab something from the closet. He nodded absently, continuing his conversation while I moved quietly to the back corner where I had stored some of my old nursing textbooks. His room was meticulously organized, nothing like the cluttered teenager's space it had been years earlier. Multiple monitors displayed financial data, graphs, and trading platforms. Stacks of business books lined the shelves, titles about wealth management, elder care, and financial planning. On his desk alongside the usual computer equipment, sat a folder labeled Fletcher Family Financial Management in his neat handwriting. As I reached for my textbooks, I couldn't help but notice other folders stacked nearby. Mom's spending analysis, risk assessment, cognitive decline documentation. The titles made my stomach clench. Documentation of cognitive decline. What exactly had Marcus been documenting? I grabbed my textbooks and left quickly, but the image of those folders stayed with me. That night, I lay in bed, wondering what evidence of my supposed incompetence Marcus had been collecting. What behaviors had he interpreted as signs of mental decline? What normal activities had he documented as concerning patterns? The next day, while Marcus was out meeting with a potential client, I did something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I searched his room, not extensively, not destructively, but deliberate. I needed to understand what narrative my son was constructing about my mental state and my need for protection. The folders were exactly where I had seen them, filed with the same precision. Marcus brought to everything. I opened Mom's spending analysis first, expecting to find the same transaction lists he showed me during our weekly meetings. Instead, I found something much more disturbing. Marcus had been tracking not just my purchases, but my behavior pattern. He had notes about times I forgot where I put my reading glasses, instances when I couldn't remember a neighbor's name, occasions when I seemed confused by technology. Each incident was dated, described in clinical detail, and categorized by type of cognitive lapse. October 3rd, Mom spent 15 minutes looking for car keys that were in her purse, seemed frustrated and disoriented when she found them. October 8th, Mom couldn't remember the name of the new medication her doctor prescribed, had to call the pharmacy twice to clarify. October 12th, Mom appeared confused by the new interface on her banking app, required assistance to complete simple transaction. Reading these entries felt like discovering surveillance footage of my own life. Marcus wasn't just managing my finances, he was building a case for my incompetence. Every normal moment of human forgetfulness had been recorded as evidence of decline. Every instance of technological confusion had been documented as cognitive failure. The risk assessment folder was even worse. Marcus had created a formal evaluation of my ability to live independently, complete with scoring rubrics and professional-looking charts. He had rated my decision-making capacity, my financial judgment, my physical stability, and my social awareness. In every category, I was scored as declining or requires supervision, but it was the cognitive decline documentation folder that truly revealed the scope of what Marcus was doing. He had been researching dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and age-related cognitive decline for months. He had printed articles about early warning signs, caregiver responsibilities, and legal options for managing incapacitated adults. He had contact information for elder law attorneys, geriatric psychiatrists, and assisted living facilities. Marcus wasn't just controlling my finances as a temporary protective measure, he was preparing for the day when he would need to take complete control of my life. He genuinely believed I was losing my mental capacity, and he was documenting evidence to support eventual guardianship proceedings. Sitting on his bed, surrounded by folders full of my supposed failures, I felt a rage unlike anything I had experienced since David's death. Not the hot, explosive anger of a moment, but the cold, steady fury of someone who has been systematically underestimated and undermined. My son wasn't protecting me from cognitive decline, he was manufacturing evidence of it. Every confused moment he had documented was explicable. I had looked for my keys, because I was rushing to get to work after staying up late helping a colleague with a difficult case. I had forgotten my medication name, because my doctor had changed my prescription 3 times in 2 weeks, trying to find the right dosage. I had been confused by my banking app, because the bank had updated their entire interface without warning. These weren't signs of dementia, they were signs of being human, of being busy, of being stressed by having a son who monitored my every move and questioned my every decision. Marcus had taken normal life experiences and pathologized them, turning my humanity into evidence of incompetence. But the most infuriating part was that I had participated in my own diminishment. Every time Marcus suggested I was confused, I had questioned my own perceptions. Every time he offered to handle something for me, I had accepted his help rather than insisting on my own capability. Every time he expressed concern about my judgment, I had doubted myself rather than trusting my own experience. I had allowed my son to gaslight me into believing I was less competent than I actually was. I had accepted his narrative of decline, because it was easier than confronting the possibility that the child I had raised and sacrificed for had developed such a distorted view of my capabilities. Closing the folders, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. I would not confront Marcus directly, not yet. Instead, I would begin gathering my own evidence. If my son wanted to document behavior patterns, then I would document his. If he wanted to build a case for my incompetence, then I would build a case for his manipulation. I started a journal that evening, not the kind Marcus would recognize as concerning behavior, but a careful record of our interaction. I documented every conversation where he questioned my judgment, every instance where he made me doubt my own perceptions, every moment when his helpful suggestions felt more like control than concern. October 15th, Marcus questioned my decision to donate $50 to the animal shelter, suggesting that charitable giving should be strategic rather than emotional, made me feel guilty for wanting to help homeless pets. October 16th, Marcus insisted on reviewing my grocery list before I went shopping, removing items he deemed impulse purchases including ice cream and magazines. Writing these things down helped me see patterns I had missed while living them. Marcus wasn't just managing my money, he was managing my choices, my preferences, my autonomy. He had appointed himself the arbiter of what was reasonable for me to want, what was appropriate for me to buy, what was safe for me to do. Over the next week, I began testing boundaries in small ways. I bought a book without asking permission, using cash from my carefully hoarded weekly allowance. I made a doctor's appointment without consulting Marcus about the timing. I invited my friend Rebecca over for dinner without clearing it with him first. Each of these actions was met with gentle disapproval disguised as concern. "Mom, you really should check with me before making financial commitments. I wish you had let me know about the doctor's appointment. I could have driven you. Next time you want to have company, just give me a heads up so I can make sure the house is presentable." The pattern was consistent. Marcus presented every independent action I took as evidence that I needed more supervision, not less. My desire to make my own choices was reframed as confusion about appropriate decision-making. My normal adult activities were treated as risky behaviors that required oversight, but I was no longer accepting his interpretations without question. When Marcus suggested that buying a book without consulting him showed impulsive spending patterns, I calmly pointed out that I had been buying books regularly for 30 years without financial catastrophe. When he worried about me driving to a doctor's appointment alone, I reminded him that I had been driving safely for 4 decades and had never had an accident. These conversations revealed something interesting. Marcus had no actual evidence for his concerns about my competence. When pressed for specifics, he fell back on generalizations about age-related decline and statistics about elder vulnerability. He couldn't point to any actual mistake I had made or any real problem my independence had caused. The turning point came during one of our weekly financial meetings. Marcus was reviewing my spending for the previous 7 days, highlighting what he considered problematic purchases. "Mom, you spent $18 at a coffee shop this week. That's more than $2 per day for coffee when you could make it at home for penny." "I had coffee with Rebecca twice," I explained. "We met at that place downtown after her physical therapy appointments." Marcus made a note on his paper. "But $18 for coffee is excessive, regardless of the social aspect. You could have invited Rebecca here instead." "I wanted to meet her somewhere neutral," I said. "She's been having problems with her husband, and she needed to talk somewhere private." Marcus looked up from his notes, his expression patient but firm. "Mom, I understand you want to be supportive, but paying for expensive coffee isn't the solution to Rebecca's marital problems." "I wasn't trying to solve her problems," I said, feeling my temper rise. "I was being a friend. Friends sometimes meet for coffee. It's a normal social activity that costs less than $20. Marcus set down his pen and looked at me with the expression I had come to recognize as his difficult conversation face. "It's not just the coffee, Mom. It's the pattern, the impulsive purchases, the emotional spending, the lack of consideration for long-term financial goals. These behaviors are concerning when taken together." He pulled out one of his printed articles, this one about financial decision-making in older adults. "According to this research," he continued, "people over 55 are particularly vulnerable to emotional spending and poor financial choices." The coffee purchases might seem small, but they're indicative of larger issues with impulse control. I stared at him, this man I had raised, who was sitting in my kitchen using academic research to explain why I couldn't be trusted to buy coffee with my own money. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I am 58 years old. I have been managing money successfully since before you were born. I have raised a child, bought a house, maintained steady employment, and built a secure financial foundation for our family. I am not incompetent, and I am not in decline." "I know this is difficult to accept," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but unmoved by my protest. "But the research is clear about age-related changes in judgment and decision-making. I'm not saying you're incompetent, just that you're vulnerable to making choices you might not make if you were thinking more clearly." That phrase, "thinking more clearly," was the final straw. Marcus genuinely believed that disagreeing with his financial oversight was evidence of confused thinking. He had convinced himself that any resistance to his control was a symptom of cognitive decline rather than a reasonable response to being treated like a child. "I think we need to take a break from these meetings," I said, standing up from the table. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't need this level of financial supervision." Marcus's expression shifted from patience to alarm. "Mom, you can't just stop managing your finances. That's exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making I'm worried about." "It's not impulsive," I said calmly. "It's a thoughtful choice made by a competent adult who is tired of being treated like she has dementia." I left him sitting at the table with his spreadsheets and research articles. His carefully constructed case for my incompetence spread out like evidence in a trial I had never agreed to participate in. That night, Marcus knocked on my bedroom door, entering with the cautious manner of someone approaching a volatile situation. "Mom, I think we need to talk about what happened earlier. I'm concerned that you're feeling defensive about reasonable financial oversight." "I'm feeling manipulated," I replied without looking up from my book. "There's a difference." Marcus sat on the edge of my bed, uninvited, his presence filling the space with uncomfortable tension. "I know this feels restrictive, but you have to understand, that I'm trying to protect you from making mistakes that could jeopardize your future." "What mistakes?" I asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Can you name one actual financial mistake I've made in the past year? One poor decision that caused real problems?" Marcus paused, clearly expecting this to be an easier question. "Well, there was the donation to that charity that turned out to be a scam. I donated $25 to a legitimate animal rescue." I corrected. "You decided it was a scam because they didn't have a sophisticated website." I called them directly and confirmed they were real." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "But you didn't research them properly first." "That's the kind of impulsive giving that scammers target. So $25 to help animals makes me vulnerable to fraud?" I asked. "What about the $5,000 you invested in that cryptocurrency scheme last year? Was that properly researched?" Marcus's face flushed slightly. "That's different. I understand investment risks." "You lost the entire investment," I pointed out. "Every penny. But somehow my $25 donation is evidence of poor judgment, while your $5,000 loss is just understanding investment risks." The hypocrisy was so glaring that even Marcus seemed to recognize it. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for a response that would maintain his position of authority. "The point is," he said finally, "that you're not equipped to evaluate these kinds of decisions anymore. Your judgment isn't what it used to be, and I'm trying to protect you from the consequences of that decline." It was the most direct statement he had made about his beliefs, and it revealed the fundamental problem in our relationship. Marcus genuinely believed I was losing my mental capacity. He wasn't consciously manipulating me. He was trying to manage what he saw as inevitable cognitive decline. In his mind, taking control of my finances wasn't theft or manipulation, it was responsible caregiving. He thought he was being a good son, but his sincere belief in my incompetence didn't make his actions less harmful. If anything, it made them more dangerous because he felt justified in overriding my autonomy. Marcus had convinced himself that my desire for independence was a symptom of illness rather than a fundamental human right. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I am not in cognitive decline. I am not losing my judgment. I am not becoming incompetent. I am a healthy, intelligent woman who is capable of making her own decisions. Your concern is not based on reality." "Mom," he replied with infinite patience. "That's exactly what someone with early-stage dementia would say. Lack of insight is one of the primary symptoms. You can't see the changes because they're happening to you." This circular logic made any protest I offered proof of the very problem he was trying to solve. If I agreed that I needed supervision, that confirmed his concerns. If I disagreed, that proved I lacked insight into my own decline. Marcus had created a perfect trap where any response I gave validated his position. It was psychological manipulation, but I was beginning to understand that he didn't recognize it as such. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to prove to Marcus that his mother was exactly as competent as she had always been, but I wasn't going to do it by arguing with him or trying to convince him with words. I was going to do it by showing him the truth about who I really was and what I was actually capable of. It was time for Marcus to learn about the accounts he didn't know existed, the investments he couldn't access, and the financial sophistication his supposedly declining mother had been quietly maintaining for over 2 decades. It was time to show my son that the woman he thought needed protection had been protecting him all along. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep his control went, and what he had been doing with the power I had given him. Because if Marcus genuinely believed I was incompetent, then he might be making decisions about my money that went far beyond simple oversight, and if he was, then the conversation we were about to have would be even more complicated than I had imagined. The revelation came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, when insomnia and curiosity collided in the most productive way possible. I had been lying awake for hours, my mind churning through everything I had discovered about Marcus's documentation project, when I heard the soft ping of an email notification from his room down the hall. then another, then a series of rapid-fire alerts that suggested something urgent was happening in his digital world. I slipped out of bed and padded quietly to my kitchen, where I could see the glow of multiple monitors through his partially open door. Marcus was awake, hunched over his desk in the blue light of his screens, typing frantically. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and settled at the kitchen table where I could observe without being seen, curious about what kind of business required attention at this hour. What I witnessed over the next hour changed everything I thought I understood about my son's financial management of my life. Marcus wasn't just monitoring my spending and restricting my access to accounts. He was actively trading with my money, moving funds between investment accounts, buying and selling stocks, and managing what appeared to be a complex portfolio that I had never authorized him to create. I watched him switch between multiple browser windows, each displaying different financial platforms. He had my banking information open alongside trading accounts I didn't recognize, moving money with the casual efficiency of someone who had been doing this for months. The amounts were significant, larger than my weekly allowance, larger than my monthly expenses, larger than anything I would have considered appropriate for someone supposedly protecting me from my own poor judgment. At one point he took a phone call, speaking in hushed tones about market positions and risk tolerance. I caught fragments of the conversation, enough to understand that he was discussing my money as if it were his own, making investment decisions based on his assessment of market conditions rather than any input from me. When the call ended, he immediately executed several trades, buying stocks in companies I had never heard of with money that belonged to me. The hypocrisy was staggering. Marcus had convinced me that buying books and coffee represented dangerous impulsive spending, while secretly using my funds for high-risk stock trades in the middle of the night. He had lectured me about the importance of conservative financial planning while gambling with my retirement savings on volatile investments. He had positioned himself as my protector while engaging in exactly the kind of risky financial behavior he claimed to be protecting me from. I returned to my room and lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I had witnessed. Marcus wasn't just controlling my money, he was using it for his own investment venture. The power of attorney I had signed hadn't just given him the right to manage my accounts, it had given him access to capital for his own financial experiments. My son had turned my life savings into his personal trading fund. The next morning, Marcus appeared at breakfast with the same patient smile he always wore during our financial discussions. "Good morning, Mom. How did you sleep?" I wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for what I had seen, but something held me back. If I revealed that I had been watching him, he would simply become more careful about concealing his activities. Instead, I needed to understand the full scope of what he was doing before I decided how to respond. "Fine, sweetheart," I replied, sipping my coffee and studying his face for any sign of guilt or concern. "You were up late last night. I heard your computer running." Marcus shrugged casually, "Just catching up on some market research. Different time zones, you know. Sometimes the best opportunities happen when American markets are closed." "Market research for what?" I asked innocently. Marcus paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Just general investment strategy, part of managing your portfolio effectively." This was the first time he had mentioned managing a portfolio for me. In all our financial discussions, he had focused on controlling my spending and preventing poor decisions. He had never mentioned actively investing my money. "I didn't know I had a portfolio," I said carefully. "I thought you were just managing my checking account and bills." Marcus set down his spoon and looked at me with that familiar expression of patient concern. "Mom, we've talked about this. Your money needs to be working for you, not just sitting in low-yield savings accounts. I've been making conservative investments to help preserve your financial security." Conservative investments. I thought about the late-night trading session I had witnessed, the rapid buying and selling, the phone calls about market positions. Nothing I had seen looked conservative. "What kind of investments?" I asked. Marcus hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of curiosity about financial details. "Mostly blue-chip stocks and index funds," he said finally. "Nothing risky or speculative, just steady, long-term growth vehicles that will help your money keep pace with inflation." I nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. filing away another piece of evidence in the growing case against my son's version of reality. That afternoon, while Marcus was out meeting with another potential client, I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation of my own financial situation. I called my bank and asked to speak with someone about my account activity over the past 6 months. The customer service representative was helpful, explaining that while I could access basic information over the phone, detailed transaction records would need to be requested through their online portal or in person. Since Marcus controlled my online banking access, I drove to the local branch and requested a complete statement of all account activity since he had taken over my finances. What I discovered was both worse and more complex than I had imagined. Marcus hadn't just been making unauthorized investments, he had been systematically restructuring my entire financial life. The bank statements showed a pattern of large transfers from my checking and savings accounts to investment accounts I had never opened. Money that I thought was sitting safely in federally insured bank accounts had been moved to brokerage accounts with names I didn't recognize. Funds that Marcus claimed were being preserved for my future security had been placed in high-risk investments that fluctuated wildly in value. Most disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had opened multiple credit lines in my name, using my excellent credit score to access additional capital for his investment activity. He had taken out a home equity line of credit against my house, borrowing against the property that represented my only guaranteed security. He had opened margin accounts that allowed him to borrow money against my stock holdings, multiplying both the potential gains and the potential losses of his trading activity. The financial picture that emerged from these statements was nothing like the conservative management Marcus had described. He had transformed my simple, stable financial situation into a complex web of investments, loans, and credit lines that I didn't understand and certainly hadn't authorized. My money was no longer safe in insured bank accounts. It was scattered across multiple platforms, subject to market volatility and margin calls. But perhaps most shocking was the realization that Marcus had been taking fees for his management services. Buried in the monthly statements were charges for investment advisory services and portfolio management fees. My son was not only using my money for his own investment experiments, he was paying himself for the privilege of doing so. Sitting in my car outside the bank, staring at months of statements that revealed the systematic exploitation of my trust, I felt a kind of fury I had never experienced before. This wasn't confused financial management or overprotective caregiving. This was fraud, pure and simple. Marcus had used my power of attorney not to protect my interests, but to advance his own, turning my life savings into his personal investment fund, while convincing me that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. The drive home passed in a blur of rage and calculation. I needed to understand exactly how much damage Marcus had done to my financial security, how much risk he had exposed me to, and what my options were for protecting myself from further exploitation. But I also needed to be careful. Marcus had legal authority over my accounts, and if he suspected that I was investigating his activities, he might take steps to limit my access to information even further. That evening, I called my old friend Janet, who had worked as a financial advisor before retiring. Without revealing the full scope of what I had discovered, I asked her some hypothetical questions about power of attorney arrangements and investment management. What I learned was both helpful and terrifying. Audrey, Janet said carefully, a power of attorney is supposed to act in your best interests, not their own. If someone is using your money for investments you didn't authorize, especially risky ones, that could be considered financial abuse, even if they're family. She paused, clearly sensing there was more to my questions than idle curiosity. Is everything okay with your finances? I'm just trying to understand my options, I replied. Hypothetically, if someone had power of attorney and was making investments that the principal didn't approve of, what could be done about it? Janet's voice became more serious. The principal could revoke the power of attorney immediately. They could also file complaints with financial regulators, or even pursue criminal charges if there's evidence of theft or fraud. But what if the person with power of attorney claimed the principal was incompetent to make those decisions? Janet was quiet for a long moment. That's a more complicated situation. The courts would need to evaluate the principal's competency independently. But Audrey, if someone is using incompetency claims to justify financial abuse, that's a serious legal issue. After I hung up, I sat in my garden and tried to process the full implications of what I had learned. Marcus wasn't just controlling my finances, he was potentially committing crimes against me. The loving son who claimed to be protecting me from my own poor judgment was systematically stealing from me while building a legal case for my incompetence that would allow him to continue his exploitation indefinitely. But I also realized that I had advantages Marcus didn't know about. The offshore accounts David had established were completely outside the scope of the power of attorney I had signed. Marcus had no legal access to those funds, no knowledge of their existence, and no ability to use them for his investment scheme. The money I had accessed earlier that week represented not just financial independence, but also proof of my competence and forward thinking. More importantly, I had been documenting everything. The journal I had started contained detailed records of Marcus's manipulation, his gaslighting, and his gradual escalation of control. The bank statements I had obtained provided clear evidence of unauthorized investments and self-dealing. I had been building a case without realizing it, gathering evidence that could expose Marcus's fraud and prove my own competence simultaneously. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew I needed to do it quickly before Marcus realized that his careful manipulation was beginning to unravel. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel professional and competent, and drove downtown to the office of an attorney who specialized in elder law and financial abuse. Margaret Chen was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and an office filled with credentials that suggested she had seen every variation of family financial dysfunction. I told her the truth, all of it, starting with Marcus's gradual takeover of my accounts and ending with his unauthorized investment activities. I showed her my documentation, my bank statements, and the evidence of his systematic manipulation. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said when I finished my story, "what you're describing is financial abuse, regardless of your son's intentions. The fact that he obtained power of attorney through manipulation, rather than genuine incapacity, makes his actions even more problematic." She reviewed my bank statements with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar patterns before. The unauthorized investments, the fees he's paying himself, the credit lines opened without your knowledge, these are all violations of his fiduciary duty as your attorney. In fact, she looked up from the papers. "The good news is that you clearly have the mental capacity to understand and address this situation. The bad news is that your son has put your financial security at serious risk." Margaret explained my options with the thoroughness of someone who understood that financial abuse often came wrapped in family relationships and good intention. I could revoke the power of attorney immediately, which would cut off Marcus's access to my accounts, but might not undo the damage he had already done. I could file a complaint with the state attorney general's office, which could result in criminal charges but would likely destroy my relationship with my son permanently. "There's also a third option," she said carefully. "You could confront your son with evidence of what you've discovered, and demand that he restore your accounts to their original state. If he cooperates, you might be able to resolve this without legal action. But if he refuses or tries to manipulate you further, you'll need to be prepared for more drastic measures." I thought about Marcus, the boy who had held my hand through David's funeral, who had worked so hard to succeed in school, who had stepped up to help when I needed it most. I thought about the man who was now using my money for his own purposes, while convincing himself and others that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. The distance between those two versions of my son felt unbridgeable. "What would you recommend?" I asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "Personally, I think you should give him a chance to make this right. But I also think you should be prepared for the possibility that he won't." Financial abuse within families is often accompanied by genuine belief that the abuser is acting in the victim's best interests. "You think Marcus really believes he's helping me?" Margaret nodded. "It's common in these situations. Adult children convince themselves that their parents are declining faster than they actually are, and they use that belief to justify increasingly controlling behavior. The line between protection and exploitation can become very blurry. I left Margaret's office with a clear plan and a backup strategy if that plan failed. I would confront Marcus with evidence of his unauthorized activities and demand that he restore my financial independence immediately. If he refused or tried to manipulate me further, I would revoke the power of attorney and file formal complaints about his conduct. But first, I had one more stop to make. I drove to the downtown branch of my bank and requested access to a safe deposit box I had rented years earlier but rarely used. Inside was another gift from David, one I had hoped never to need: documentation for accounts even more secure than the offshore investments, emergency funds that could only be accessed with multiple forms of identification and in-person verification. David had been thorough in his planning, creating layers of financial security that would protect me from any conceivable threat to my independence. He had anticipated economic collapse, identity theft, medical emergencies, and even family betrayal. What he probably hadn't anticipated was that the threat would come from our own son, the child we had both loved and sacrificed. But as I sat in the bank's private viewing room, looking at account numbers and access codes written in David's careful handwriting, I felt his presence in a way I hadn't since his death. He had known, somehow, that I might need protection, not just from external threats, but from internal ones. He had given me the tools to maintain my independence no matter what challenges I faced. That evening, I cooked Marcus's favorite dinner and set the table with care. I opened a bottle of wine and lit candles, creating an atmosphere that suggested celebration rather than confrontation. When Marcus came home and saw the elaborate meal, he smiled in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be. "What's the occasion, Mom?" he asked, taking his seat across from me. "Did something good happen today?" I served him a generous portion of the beef stew he had loved since childhood and poured wine into both our glasses. "Actually, yes," I said calmly. "Something very good happened today. I discovered that I'm much more financially sophisticated than either of us realized." Marcus paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, something in my tone apparently alerting him that this wasn't going to be an ordinary dinner conversation. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. I reached into my purse and pulled out the bank statements I had obtained that afternoon, along with the documentation from Margaret Chen's office. I said, spreading the papers across the table between us, "that I've been doing some research into my own financial situation, and I've discovered some very interesting discrepancies between what you've told me and what's actually been happening with my money." Marcus set down his fork, his eyes moving quickly across the documents in front of him. "Mom," he said slowly, "where did you get these?" It was exactly the response I had expected, focusing on how I had obtained information about my own accounts, rather than addressing the unauthorized activities the documents revealed. "I got them from my bank," I replied calmly. "It's amazing what you can access when you remember that it's actually your money." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and something that might have been panic. "I can explain all of this," he said quickly. "The investments, the transfers, everything. It's all part of a comprehensive strategy to protect and grow your assets." I sipped my wine and waited for him to continue, curious to hear how he would justify what I had discovered. "The stock investments are conservative picks, blue-chip companies with strong dividend histories," he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his explanation. "I moved money out of your low-yield savings accounts because inflation was eating away at your purchasing power. These investments will help ensure your money maintains its value over time." "And the margin accounts?" I asked quietly. "The home equity line of credit, the fees you've been paying yourself for investment management services." Marcus's explanations became more hurried, less coherent. He talked about liquidity options, tax advantages, and professional management standards, but beneath his financial jargon, I could hear the desperation of someone who knew his carefully constructed justifications weren't holding up under scrutiny. "Marcus," I said when he finally stopped talking, I didn't authorize any of these investments. I didn't agree to margin trading or home equity loans. I certainly didn't approve of you paying yourself fees for managing my money without my knowledge. My voice remained calm, but my words carried the weight of absolute certainty. You signed the power of attorney, Marcus replied, his tone becoming more defensive. That gave me the legal authority to make these decisions on your behalf. I've been acting in your best interests, even if you don't understand the complexity of what I've been doing. There it was, the familiar refrain that my disagreement with his actions was evidence of my inability to understand, rather than legitimate objection to unauthorized conduct. Actually, I said, reaching for another document from my purse, I've been doing quite well at understanding complex financial arrangements. I placed David's old account statements on the table, documents that showed sophisticated international investments, currency hedging, and asset allocation strategies that put Marcus's stock picking to shame. These are accounts your father established for our family's long-term security, I continued, watching Marcus's eyes widen as he recognized the sophistication of the investment strategy. I've been managing them successfully for over 20 years, adding to them when possible, and adjusting the allocations based on global economic conditions. Marcus stared at the documents, clearly struggling to reconcile this evidence of my financial competence with his narrative of my declining capabilities. I don't understand, he said finally. If you have these accounts, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you needed help managing your finances? Because I wanted to see what you would do with the trust I gave you, I replied. I wanted to believe that my son would act in my best interests, even when he thought I wasn't capable of protecting myself. I paused, letting the implications of that statement settle between us. Instead, I discovered that you used my supposed incompetence as justification for taking control of my money and using it for your own purposes. The dinner table fell silent, except for the soft flickering of candles and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus looked older suddenly, the confident financial advisor facade cracking to reveal the frightened young man underneath. I thought I was helping you, he said quietly. I really believed you were starting to decline, that you needed protection. From what? I asked. From buying books and coffee? From donating to charity? From living my life as an independent adult? Marcus didn't answer immediately, staring at his untouched plate as if it might provide the explanation he couldn't find in himself. You seemed confused about technology, he said finally, frustrated with passwords and banking apps. You were forgetting things, misplacing things. I thought those were early warning signs. I nodded, understanding finally how Marcus had transformed normal human experiences into evidence of pathology. And when you thought I was declining, I continued, you decided that gave you the right to use my money for high-risk investments without my knowledge, to pay yourself fees for services I never requested, to take out loans against my house. The questions hung in the air, highlighting the gap between protective concern and financial exploitation. Marcus's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his wine glass. I was trying to grow your assets, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The investments were performing well. I was generating returns you couldn't have achieved with conservative savings accounts. It was true that some of his investments had been profitable, but that wasn't the point. Marcus, I said gently, the performance of your investments is irrelevant. You didn't have permission to make them. You used my money without my consent while convincing me that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. That's not financial management, it's financial abuse. The word hung between us like a blade, cutting through months of manipulation and self-deception. I never meant to hurt you, Marcus said, and I could hear genuine anguish in his voice. I thought I was being responsible, taking care of you the way you took care of. I felt a stab of sympathy for my son, recognizing finally that his exploitation of my trust had been motivated by genuine, if misguided, concern. The way I took care of you, I replied, was by supporting your independence, not by taking it away. I helped you succeed, not by controlling your choices, but by giving you the resources to make your own choices. The distinction seemed to land with him, his face cycling through understanding and regret. We sat in silence for several minutes, the elaborate dinner cooling between us while we both processed the implications of what had been revealed. Finally, Marcus looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child caught in a serious mistake. What do you want me to do? He asked simply, It was the first time in months that he had asked for my preferences rather than telling me what was best for me. I want you to restore my accounts to exactly the state they were in before you started managing them, I said clearly. I want you to close any investments you made without my authorization, pay off any loans you took out in my name, and return my money to federally insured bank accounts where it will be safe. And then, Marcus asked quietly, what happens to... I looked at my son, this complex young man who had both loved me and betrayed me, often simultaneously. Then we figure out how to have a relationship based on respect rather than control, I said, if that's something you're willing to work toward. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding finally that his mother was not the confused, declining woman he had convinced himself she was, but rather a competent adult who had been giving him enough rope to either climb to safety or hang himself with. He had chosen poorly, but perhaps not irreversibly. The conversation that followed was the most honest we had shared in years, and the most difficult, but it was also the beginning of something new, a relationship where I was no longer performing the role of grateful dependent, and Marcus was no longer performing the role of protective caregiver. For the first time in months, we were just two adults trying to figure out how to love each other without causing harm. The process of untangling Marcus's financial manipulations would take weeks, but it would happen under my oversight and according to my specifications. My son was about to learn that his mother had been far more capable all along than either of them had realized, and that respect, not control, was the foundation of any relationship worth preserving. The restoration process began the following morning with a phone call that Marcus made while I watched, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with my coffee and a legal pad where I recorded every account number, every transaction, every promise he made to reverse his unauthorized activity. His voice was subdued as he spoke with various brokerage representatives, explaining that he needed to liquidate positions and transfer funds back to traditional savings accounts at his principal's request. Yes, I understand there may be penalties for early withdrawal, he said into the phone, glancing at me nervously. The account holder wants everything moved back to FDIC-insured accounts immediately. I could hear the customer service representative on the other end asking questions about market timing and investment goals, trying to talk Marcus out of what they clearly considered a poor financial decision. I appreciate your concern, Marcus continued, but this is not a discussion about strategy. These are instructions from the account owner that need to be executed today. As I listened to him navigate these conversations, I realized how completely our dynamic had shifted overnight. Marcus was no longer making decisions about my money, he was implementing my decisions, reluctantly but without argument. The process was more complicated than either of us had anticipated. Some investments had waiting periods before they could be liquidated. Others required specific documentation or cooling-off periods designed to protect investors from making impulsive decisions. The margin accounts needed to be closed carefully to avoid triggering tax consequences or margin call. The home equity line of credit would take several weeks to pay off and close completely. How much did you invest in cryptocurrency? I asked, reviewing a statement that showed significant allocations to digital assets I had never heard of. Marcus's face flushed slightly. About $15,000, he admitted. It was performing really well until recently. I looked at the current value of those holdings, which had dropped to less than $8,000 in the past month. So you gambled away $7,000 of my money on internet coins, I said calmly, making a note on my legal pad. The same money you said needed to be protected from my impulsive coffee purchase. Marcus had no response to this observation, perhaps finally recognizing the absurdity of his risk assessment. Over the next several days, I accompanied Marcus to various financial institutions, as he unwound the complex web of accounts and investments he had created. At each stop, I introduced myself as the account owner and made it clear that I was personally overseeing the restoration of my finance. The reaction from bank representatives was uniformly professional but curious, clearly wondering why a competent-seeming woman needed her son to handle these transactions. At Wells Fargo, where Marcus had opened the home equity line of credit, the loan officer reviewed our request to pay off and close the account early. Miss Letcher, she said, I want to make sure you understand that this line of credit could be valuable to have available for emergencies or opportunities. Are you certain you want to close it completely? Completely certain, I replied. I never authorized it to be opened in the first place, and I don't want the temptation of easy access to borrowed money. The loan officer looked confused, glancing between Marcus and me. But you're listed as the co-applicant on the original paperwork. Your signature is on all the documents. I felt a chill of recognition. Could I see those documents? The loan officer hesitated, then pulled up the digital copies of the application materials. There, in what looked like my handwriting, was my signature on forms I had never seen before. When was this application submitted? I asked. 6 months ago, she replied. October 15th to be specific. I remembered that date clearly. It was the day after I had signed the power of attorney, when I was still reeling from Marcus's presentation about my supposed financial incompetence. I had been emotionally vulnerable, trusting completely, and apparently willing to sign anything Marcus put in front of me without reading it carefully. Marcus, I said quietly, did you have me sign these loan documents without explaining what they were? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I told you they were financial planning documents, he said defensively. I explained that we were consolidating your accounts and optimizing your asset allocation. Asset allocation, I repeated. You told me I was signing papers to move money between my existing accounts. You didn't mention that I was borrowing $50,000 against my house. The loan officer was clearly uncomfortable witnessing this family dispute, but I needed to understand exactly what I had signed and when. Miss Letcher, the loan officer said carefully, if you signed these documents without understanding what they were, that could be grounds for challenging the validity of the loan. She looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she had seen similar situations before. Financial institutions have strict requirements about informed consent for major credit decisions. I made another note on my legal pad. Marcus's deception had been more extensive than I had initially realized. He hadn't just used the power of attorney to make unauthorized investments. He had manipulated me into signing loan documents while I was in a vulnerable emotional state. We'll pay off the loan and close the account, I said firmly. And I'd like a copy of all the original application materials for my records. The pattern repeated itself at other institutions. Marcus had used my emotional vulnerability in the days following my signing of the power of attorney to obtain my signature on multiple documents I hadn't understood. Credit card applications, investment account openings, risk tolerance assessments that authorized increasingly aggressive trading strategies. Each revelation added another layer to my understanding of how systematically I had been manipulated. By the end of the week, I had a complete picture of the financial damage Marcus had caused. In addition to the investment losses and loan interest, he had paid himself nearly $12,000 in management fees over the past 6 months. He had also used my credit to open trading accounts for his own investments, essentially using my financial standing to access capital for his personal use. The total cost of your financial management, I told him over dinner Friday evening, including losses, fees and interest charges, is approximately $38,000. Marcus looked stricken. I can pay you back, he said quickly. The consulting business is starting to take off, and I can make monthly payments until everything is restored. With what money? I asked. You don't have steady income, you've been living in my house rent-free, and you just lost $7,000 on cryptocurrency speculation. Marcus had no answer, perhaps finally recognizing that his ability to repay the money he had taken was as questionable as his judgment in taking it. There's something else we need to discuss, I continued, pulling out another set of documents. Your living situation here. Marcus looked up sharply, clearly not expecting this conversation. What do you mean? He asked. I mean that you're 35 years old, and it's time for you to live independently, I said calmly. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary while you found your footing professionally. Instead, it's become a situation where you're using my resources to fund your lifestyle while convincing yourself that I'm the one who needs support. Marcus's face went through several expressions before settling on something like panic. Mom, I can't afford my own place right now. The consulting work is inconsistent, and I'm still paying off student loans. I need more time to get established. It was the same argument he had been making for months, but now I heard it differently. Marcus, I said gently, you've been out of school for 2 years. You've had multiple opportunities to build a stable income, but you've chosen to pursue high-risk ventures instead of steady employment. Living here has enabled you to take those risks, because you don't have the normal financial pressures that would force you to be more conservative. But I'm helping you, he protested. I'm managing your technology, handling your appointments, taking care of maintenance around the house. I smiled at this characterization of our arrangement. You're managing my technology by controlling my passwords and limiting my access to my own accounts. You're handling my appointments by screening my decisions and questioning my choice. You're taking care of maintenance by doing occasional yard work while living rent-free in a house worth $300,000. The math was stark when presented that clearly. Marcus was saving at least $1,800 per month by living with me, money he was using to fund his business ventures and trading activities. Meanwhile, he was charging me for financial management services, while systematically undermining my independence and autonomy. I think it's time for you to move out, I said quietly, not because I don't love you, but because this living arrangement has become unhealthy for both of us. Marcus stared at me as if I had announced my intention to sell him into slavery. You can't be serious, he said. After everything we've been through together, after all the ways I've tried to help you, you haven't been helping me, I replied. You've been controlling me while convincing yourself it was help. There's a difference, and until you understand that difference, we can't have a healthy relationship. I pulled out a calendar and marked a date, 6 weeks in the future. I'll give you until the end of February to find your own place. That's enough time to save a security deposit and find suitable housing. Marcus spent the next hour alternating between arguments about my need for his assistance and pleas for more time to establish his financial independence. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel compelled to accommodate his preferences or negotiate my own boundaries. He was an adult who had made choices that led to his current situation, and those consequences belonged to him, not to me. What if I can't find a place I can afford? He asked finally. What if the consulting business doesn't generate enough income to cover rent and expenses? I looked at my son, this grown man who was asking his mother to guarantee his financial security while simultaneously arguing that she was too incompetent to manage her own affairs. Then you'll need to find steady employment, I said simply. Most adults support themselves through regular jobs rather than entrepreneurial ventures. There's no shame in working for someone else while you build your business on the side. Marcus looked genuinely shocked by this suggestion, as if the idea of traditional employment was beneath his education and aspirations. But I have an MBA, he said. I shouldn't have to take just any job to pay rent. This statement revealed so much about Marcus's attitude toward work and responsibility. He believed his education entitled him to immediate success and financial comfort, regardless of his actual performance or value in the marketplace. Your MBA gives you qualifications, I replied, but it doesn't guarantee outcomes. Success still requires work, persistence, and sometimes accepting positions that aren't ideal while you build towards something better. It was a lesson I had learned during my own career, working double shifts and taking on extra responsibilities to advance professionally while raising a child. Did you think I wanted to work weekend shifts at the clinic while you were in college? I continued. Did you think I enjoyed picking up extra hours to pay for your MBA program? I did those things because they were necessary, not because they were pleasant or perfectly aligned with my career goal. Marcus had no response to this, perhaps recognizing finally that his mother's sacrifices had enabled his current sense of entitlement. The woman he thought needed protection had been supporting his lifestyle and ambitions for years, working harder and longer than necessary to give him advantages he now took for granted. The conversation ended with Marcus retreating to his room, presumably to contemplate the reality of independent living for the first time in his adult life. I sat alone in the kitchen, feeling simultaneously relieved and saddened by the necessity of these boundary-setting conversations. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the quiet satisfaction of advocating for myself instead of accommodating everyone else's comfort. Over the weekend, I continued the process of reclaiming my financial independence. I changed all my passwords to combinations only I knew, using a secure password manager that Marcus couldn't access. I updated my contact information with all my financial institutions, ensuring that account alerts and statements would come directly to me rather than being filtered through my son. I also made an appointment with a different financial advisor, someone Marcus had never met and couldn't influence. Margaret Chen had recommended a woman named Sarah Kim, who specialized in helping people recover from financial abuse and rebuild their monetary autonomy. I wanted professional guidance about managing the accounts Marcus was returning to me, but more importantly, I wanted someone who understood that my goal was independence, not just security. Miss Fletcher, Sarah said when I explained my situation, what you've described is unfortunately common in family financial abuse cases. Adult children often convince themselves they're protecting aging parents while actually serving their own interests. She reviewed the documentation I had brought, including the investment losses and unauthorized fees Marcus had generated. The good news is that you clearly have the knowledge and temperament to manage your own finances, she continued. The offshore accounts you've maintained show sophisticated understanding of international investing and risk management. You don't need someone else to make decisions for you. You just need systems that support your independence. Sarah helped me create a comprehensive financial plan that balanced security with growth while maintaining my complete control over all decisions. We established automatic transfers that would fund my monthly expenses without requiring constant attention, while keeping the bulk of my assets in investments I understood and had chosen myself. Most importantly, everything was structured so that I could manage it independently, without needing assistance from anyone else. What about my son? I asked. Is there a way to help him understand money management, without enabling his irresponsible behavior? Sarah smiled, recognizing the complexity of family relationships and financial boundaries. The best thing you can do for your son is model healthy financial behavior and refuse to rescue him from the consequences of his poor choices. That doesn't mean you can't have a relationship with him, she continued, but it does mean that relationship should be based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. If he's genuinely interested in learning from your experience, he'll ask questions and listen to your answer. If he's just looking for someone to fund his lifestyle, he'll continue trying to manipulate your emotions. I left that meeting with a clear framework for moving forward and a renewed confidence in my own financial judgment. The woman Marcus had convinced needed protection was actually more financially sophisticated than most people her age, with resources and knowledge that could support a comfortable and independent retirement. Monday morning brought the first test of my new boundary. Marcus emerged from his room looking haggard, clearly having spent the weekend contemplating his housing situation. Mom, he said over coffee, I've been thinking about what you said, and I think we should compromise. What kind of compromise? I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a spreadsheet that looked remarkably similar to the financial presentations he used to justify controlling my money. I've calculated the costs of independent living, he said, turning the screen toward me, and it's not financially viable for me right now, but I could pay you rent for staying here, maybe $400 a month, plus handling all the household maintenance and technology management. I looked at his proposal, noting that $400 wouldn't cover even a quarter of the market rent for his current living situation. And the technology management would involve what exactly? I asked. Marcus's expression brightened, apparently interpreting my question as interest rather than skepticism. Password security, software updates, online banking oversight, investment monitoring, he said eagerly. All the digital infrastructure that modern life requires. I could handle all of that so you don't have to worry about cybersecurity or making mistakes with complex financial platforms. There it was again, the suggestion that I was too incompetent to manage my own digital life, wrapped in an offer of assistance that would essentially restore his control over my finances. Marcus, I said calmly, I don't need technology management. I need you to move out and establish your own independent life, but the rent you're proposing wouldn't even cover utilities, I continued. And the technology services you're offering are things I've been managing successfully for years before you took them over. Marcus's face fell as he realized his compromise offer wasn't being received as generously as he had hoped. I don't understand why you're being so rigid about this, he said, his voice taking on the frustrated tone I had learned to recognize as a prelude to manipulation. We're family. We should be supporting each other, not creating artificial barriers that benefit no one. Supporting each other doesn't mean enabling financial irresponsibility, I replied, and independence isn't an artificial barrier, it's a basic requirement of adult life. Marcus closed his laptop with more force than necessary, clearly frustrated by my refusal to negotiate on this boundary. "Fine," he said. "I'll start looking for apartments this week, but I want you to know that this is going to make everything more difficult for both of us." I recognize this as an attempt to make me feel guilty for enforcing reasonable expectations, but it no longer had the power to change my mind. "Difficulty isn't always bad," I said gently. "Sometimes it's the pressure that forces us to grow and become more capable." Marcus left for his apartment hunting with obvious reluctance, but I felt hopeful that this experience might eventually help him develop the self-reliance he had been avoiding. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done in months. I made a significant financial decision entirely on my own. Using funds from one of the offshore accounts, I purchased a new car to replace the aging Honda I had been driving for 8 years. Not because I needed Marcus's permission or approval, but because I wanted reliable transportation and had the means to afford it. The feeling of walking into a dealership, evaluating options, negotiating terms, and writing a check without consulting anyone else was intoxicating. I chose a sensible but well-appointed sedan that would serve me well for years to come, and I felt proud of my decision-making process and confident in my choice. When Marcus returned that evening and saw the new car in the driveway, his reaction was immediate and predictable. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had discovered evidence of seriously impaired judgment. "You bought a car without discussing it with anyone?" "I bought a car because I needed one and could afford it," I replied calmly. "It's the kind of decision competent adults make regularly." Marcus circled the vehicle as if he were a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. "How much did this cost?" he asked. "Did you get financing? What's the interest rate? Did you research reliability ratings and resale value?" "Marcus," I said firmly, "this is exactly the kind of questioning that I will no longer tolerate. I made a thoughtful decision about a purchase I could afford with money that belongs entirely to me. Your approval is neither required nor requested." The clarity of this boundary seemed to surprise him, perhaps because it was the first time I had refused to justify a decision to him. "But what if you got a bad deal?" he persisted. "What if there were better options you didn't consider? What if this impacts your long-term financial security?" Each question revealed his underlying assumption that I was incapable of making good decisions without his oversight. "Then I'll learn from the experience and make better decisions next time," I said. "That's how adults develop judgment and competence, by making choices and living with the consequences." Marcus looked genuinely distressed by this concept, as if the idea of letting me make potentially imperfect decisions was a form of neglect. That evening, as I sat in my garden with a cup of tea, I reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. I had gone from feeling helpless and controlled to feeling empowered and autonomous. The transition hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been comfortable for Marcus, but it had been necessary. My son was learning, slowly and reluctantly, that his mother was not the declining, vulnerable woman he had convinced himself she was. More importantly, I was remembering that I had never actually been that woman at all. I had simply allowed someone else's fears and assumptions to define my reality for a brief but expensive period of time. The road ahead would require continued vigilance and boundary maintenance. Marcus might continue trying to manipulate me into accepting his management, especially if his independent living situation proved challenging. But I now had the tools, the resources, and the confidence to maintain my autonomy regardless of external pressure. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment again. The woman who had successfully managed international investments for 20 years, who had raised a child while working full-time, who had navigated widowhood and single parenthood with grace and determination, that woman had never actually disappeared. She had just been temporarily convinced to hide while someone else took control of her life. Now she was back, and she had no intention of relinquishing control again. The offshore accounts that Marcus couldn't access had proven to be more than just financial resources. They had been proof of my own competence and foresight. David's gift hadn't just been money, it had been the confidence that came from knowing I was capable of protecting myself and making my own choices. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but it was irreversible. I had stepped back into my own power, and I intended to use it wisely and independently for whatever years lay ahead. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making breakfast for one, watching through the window as my neighbor walked her new puppy past the garden where David's roses were finally blooming the way he had envisioned them. The morning light caught the dewdrops on the petals, creating tiny prisms that scattered rainbows across the grass. For the first time since his death, those flowers didn't make me sad. They made me grateful for the foresight of a man who had loved me enough to ensure I would always have choice. Marcus had moved out in March, eventually finding a modest apartment across town that he could afford on the salary from the accounting firm where he had finally accepted a position. The transition hadn't been smooth. There had been sulking, arguments about fairness, and several attempts to guilt me into changing my mind by emphasizing how difficult independent living was proving to be for him. But I had held firm, offering emotional support without financial rescue, love without enabling. The process of rebuilding our relationship was ongoing and complicated. Marcus called every Sunday now, conversations that were sometimes stilted but gradually becoming more genuine. He asked about my week, my health, my activities, without the undertone of assessment that had characterized our interactions for so long. I shared details about my life without feeling the need to justify my choices or seek his approval. We were learning to be family without being enmeshed, connected without being controlling. The consulting business he had tried to build while living with me had failed completely once he faced the financial pressure of supporting himself. It turned out that entrepreneurship required both capital and risk tolerance that Marcus didn't actually possess when the consequences of failure would be his own rather than mine. The accounting job he had initially considered beneath his education had provided him with steady income and, perhaps more importantly, a realistic understanding of his own capabilities and preferences. "I think I was trying to be something I'm not," he had admitted during one of our recent phone calls. "The business stuff, the investment strategies, all of that. I was good at it when it was theoretical, but when real money was at stake, I made terrible decisions." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging that his management of my finances had been as much about his own financial insecurity as it had been about concern for my welfare. I had chosen not to pursue legal action against Marcus for the financial abuse. The money he had lost through poor investments and fees was significant, but not devastating to my overall financial security. More importantly, prosecuting my own son would have destroyed any possibility of salvaging our relationship, and despite everything that had happened, I still loved him and hoped we could find a way forward together. Instead, I had focused on rebuilding the boundaries and systems that would protect me from future manipulation while leaving room for a healthy relationship with my child. I had established clear protocols for any financial discussions between us. Marcus could ask questions about my choices if he was genuinely curious, but he could not offer advice unless I specifically requested it. He could express concern about my welfare, but he could not use that concern to justify any attempt to control my decision. The offshore accounts that David had established remained my secret weapon, a financial foundation that existed completely outside any potential family drama or manipulation. I had continued growing those investments, adding to them when possible, and watching them compound steadily over the year. They represented not just money but independence, security, and proof that I was fully capable of managing complex financial arrangements. Sarah Kim had become more than just a financial advisor. She had become a friend and advocate who understood the unique challenges of reclaiming autonomy after financial abuse. We met quarterly to review my investment strategy and adjust my financial plan as needed, but more importantly, she provided validation that my desire for independence was healthy and appropriate. "You've made remarkable progress," she told me during our most recent meeting. "When you first came to see me, you were questioning your own competence despite clear evidence of sophisticated financial knowledge. Now you're making decisions with confidence and managing your resources with skill that would impress any professional." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized, coming from someone who had no investment in making me feel better but every reason to give me honest feedback. I had also reconnected with friends and activities that had been neglected during the months when Marcus's control had made me feel isolated and confused. My reading group had welcomed me back warmly, and I had even started leading discussions occasionally, sharing insights about books with the same confidence I had once brought to financial decisions. Rebecca and I met for coffee regularly, and I no longer felt embarrassed about spending money on these simple pleasures. The house felt different now too. I had redecorated Marcus's former room, turning it into a proper office where I could manage my own affairs and pursue interests that had been dormant for too long. I had enrolled in an online poetry workshop, returning to the creative writing that had once been such an important part of my identity. The poems I was producing weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, expressing thoughts and feelings that I no longer felt compelled to hide or apologize for. One poem, written on a particularly satisfying morning when I had successfully navigated a complex investment decision entirely on my own, captured something essential about the transformation I had undergone. I was told I was forgetting when I was only tired, told I was declining when I was only quiet. The woman who grew silent was not disappearing, she was listening, learning the sound of her own voice underneath the noise of other people's fear. The poem wasn't sophisticated, but it was true, and truth had become more important to me than sophistication. I had spent too many years trying to be the person others needed me to be, accommodating their comfort at the expense of my own authenticity. Now I was more interested in being real than being pleasant, more committed to honesty than harmony. The most unexpected development had been my return to nursing, not full-time but as a volunteer at a local clinic that served patients who couldn't afford regular health. The work reminded me of skills and knowledge I had developed over decades of professional experience, capabilities that had nothing to do with anyone else's assessment of my competence. When I helped a frightened patient understand their diagnosis or provided comfort during a difficult procedure, I felt the quiet satisfaction of using my abilities to make a real difference. The clinic work also introduced me to other women my age who were navigating their own challenges with autonomy and respect. Many of them had stories similar to mine, tales of adult children or spouses who had gradually assumed control over their lives while claiming to act in their best interest. We formed an informal support network, sharing strategies for maintaining independence and recognizing manipulation before it became entrenched. The thing about financial abuse, one woman named Dorothy told me over lunch after a particularly busy morning at the clinic, is that it's usually committed by people who genuinely believe they're helping. That makes it harder to recognize and harder to resist because you want to trust their motive. Dorothy had experienced something similar with her daughter, who had convinced her to sign over power of attorney during a minor health scare, and then used that authority to control every aspect of her mother's life. "How did you get your independence back?" I asked. Dorothy smiled, expression that mixed satisfaction with hard-won wisdom. "I did exactly what you did. I stopped asking permission and started making decisions. When my daughter realized she couldn't manipulate me anymore, she had to choose between respecting me or losing me. Fortunately, she chose respect." These conversations helped me understand that my experience with Marcus hadn't been unique or particularly unusual. Financial abuse within families was common, often perpetrated by people who convinced themselves they were acting out of love and concern. The pattern was almost always the same: gradual erosion of the victim's autonomy, systematic questioning of their competence, and increasing control over their resources and decisions. But I had also learned that recovery was possible, that relationships could be rebuilt on healthier foundations, and that independence, once reclaimed, could be maintained with appropriate boundaries and support systems. The key was refusing to internalize other people's assessments of your capabilities and trusting your own experience and judgment even when others questioned it. Marcus and I were still working on rebuilding trust, but the foundation was stronger now because it was based on honesty rather than manipulation. He no longer tried to manage my decisions, and I no longer felt compelled to seek his approval for my choices. When he visited for dinner occasionally, we talked about his work, my volunteer activities, books we were reading, and plans for the future. Normal conversations between two adults who cared about each other but maintained separate lives. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he had said during his most recent visit. Words that would have meant everything to me 6 months earlier but now felt simply nice, rather than necessary. "You've really figured out how to take care of yourself." I had smiled and thanked him, but I had also gently corrected his framing. "I always knew how to take care of myself. I replied. I just forgot for a while that I didn't need anyone else's permission to do it. Marcus had nodded, perhaps understanding finally that my competence hadn't been something I had developed recently but something I had always possessed, and temporarily allowed him to obscure. The offshore accounts remained my private security, growing quietly and providing peace of mind that extended far beyond their monetary value. David's foresight had given me more than financial resources. It had given me proof of my own capability and the confidence to trust my own judgment. Every quarterly statement that showed steady growth was validation that I could manage complex investments successfully without anyone else's oversight or approval. I had also established new traditions and routines that reflected my reclaimed autonomy. Every morning I made myself a proper breakfast and sat in the garden with my coffee, watching the world wake up around me. Every Friday I bought fresh flowers for the house, not because they were practical but because they brought me joy. Every month I made a significant donation to a cause I cared about, not because it was tax efficient, but because it felt good to use my resources to support work I believed in. These might seem like small acts of independence, but they represented something much larger: the right to make choices based on my own values and preferences, rather than someone else's assessment of what was appropriate or reasonable for me. Every decision I made without seeking permission was a declaration that I was the authority on my own life. The woman who had once felt confused and controlled had been replaced by someone who felt confident and capable, not because I had learned new skills or gained new knowledge, but because I had stopped accepting other people's limitations as my own. The difference between the person I had been 6 months ago and the person I was now wasn't in my actual capabilities, but in my willingness to trust and use those capabilities. Standing in my kitchen on this particular morning, I felt deeply grateful for the journey that had brought me to this place of clarity and strength. The path had been difficult and sometimes painful, requiring me to confront uncomfortable truths about people I loved and assumptions I had accepted, without question. But it had also been necessary, teaching me lessons about autonomy and self-respect that I would carry forward for whatever years remained. My phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. It was Rebecca calling to confirm our lunch plans and share news about her grandson's graduation. As we chatted about normal life events, I realized how much I had missed these easy, uncomplicated friendships during the months when every conversation felt fraught with hidden assessments and potential manipulation. "You sound happy," Rebecca said as our call was ended. "Really happy, not just polite happy," I considered her observation, recognizing the truth in it. I was happy, genuinely content in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or validation. It was the happiness that comes from living authentically, making your own choices, and taking responsibility for your own life. After we hung up, I sat for a few more minutes in my garden, surrounded by flowers I had chosen and planted, in a house I owned and maintained, supported by resources I had carefully managed and protected. This was what independence looked like, not isolation or selfishness, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself and choose how to spend your time and energy. The offshore accounts that Marcus had never known about remained my secret, a private foundation of security that existed completely separate from any family dynamics or potential future manipulation. They were proof that the woman everyone had been trying to protect was actually far more capable of protecting herself than anyone had realized. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start another day filled with choices that were entirely my own, I thought about David and the gift he had given me through his careful planning. He had known, somehow, that I might need protection, not just from external threats, but from the well-meaning control of people who loved me, but didn't trust my judgment. His foresight had saved me from more than financial insecurity. It had saved me from the loss of my own autonomy. The sun was higher now, warming the roses and casting long shadows across the grass. I had volunteer work at the clinic this afternoon, dinner plans with a friend this evening, and a poetry workshop to attend tomorrow morning. My calendar was full of activities I had chosen, commitments I had made, and relationships I was nurturing, on my own terms. This was what freedom looked like, not the absence of responsibility or connection, but the presence of choice and self-determination. I had learned to trust my own judgment again, to value my own preferences, and to protect my own interests without apology or explanation. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.